Hi friends, we have started this Microsoft Agent Framework series, and day one we have covered about Azure AI Foundry and Agent Framework, and we have also gone through like what is AI Foundry and how it has this resource project and deployment, and we have also gone through Agent Framework where we have this like the run async and run streaming async method and instructions and the name of the agent. So if you see the piece of code, right, this is a piece of code where we have covered about Foundry project endpoint, project model, Foundry model, and then some piece of code where we have connecting with the Foundry project, and then with the set of the deployment model and the instructions we are invoking the agent. So even before that, right, we also covered a few other uh, topics, right, how we can actually connect to the Microsoft Foundry, and we have created an app registration within Azure AI portal, and we have generated this client ID, tenant ID, and secret, and then we have added this particular service principal into the Foundry within the IAM, and we have also discussed why we need this all these client ID, tenant ID, and because of this default Azure credentials we have used that. On day 2, right, we will go deep dive on C# function tools. So like that your agent can actually is based out of an LLM, and it understand the tokens, right? So how can the LLM ask like how can LLM invoke a particular function? So that is what we will cover today. So you have implemented some EMI method, okay, which calculates an equated monthly installments of your loan or some amount that you have taken at some percent of interest. So this particular logic is something which but not the LLM, and you want LLM to identify this piece of code and should be able to understand when to invoke this piece of code. So if you see, right, in the day one we have just seen as AIAgent. So in day 2 we will also include this tools array, which has the list of methods which we will send as a parameters, okay. And if you consider what is a function tool, right, like it's just a normal C# method, and we invoke these have these as a decorators to the method as well as parameters, and also the return type that goes back to the LLM. So if you see how we have this loop, right, a user invokes the model, and model identifies that it has to invoke your C# code, since the user is asking an EMI, and then your C# code, once it is executed, it returns the response back to the model, and model then identify like understands the response from your method, and then phrases the user message. So what it wants to send to user, it phrases that in a good format, and it sends to the user. So if you see here, user has asked EMI for 25 lakhs for 5 years for 7%, and then model calls the calculate EMI, and the model was able to successfully convert these 5 years into number of months, because we have specified the parameter as number of months. So that is why it has converted this 5 into years, like 5 into 12 is 60, and then this method, right, it has actually written the EMI string, and then model writes a response back to the user. So I have created a basic EMI tool which is having all these calculation logic, and if you see here, right, I have given the description saying that this particular method should be used when, like this defines when it has to use this particular method. And if you see what each input parameter, so description is given for each input parameter as well. So this helps LLM to what value it has to send based on the user input that he has provided. So if a user provided principal amount, right, it actually can identifies that this is a principal amount parameter, and based on this description it identifies that. Yeah, and how to register that tool. So to register that tool, we have to actually add this tools array, and then this AIFunctionFactory.Create. So I'll explain you with the code here and VS Code. So let's go back to the VS Code and see how it goes out there. Yeah, so let us go to the I have already created a project here, and I have also added all these packages. If you see here, to create the project, right, I have created the .NET console and this command tool calls as a project name which I have defined, and then I have already went into that particular project and then added all these packages. So one is Azure AI projects, and then Azure Identity, and then Microsoft Agents AI Foundry package. I have added all these packages, and then for the interest of time, right, I have just added this tools called code base which I have added over here. Yeah, so if you see here, right, we have already known yesterday, like in the previous video, we already know the project endpoint and foundry model, which are used to establish a connection to an Azure AI Foundry. And then I have created this calculate AMI tool, and this calculate AMI tool has this description and input parameters. So LLM is good enough to identify this particular piece of code, and it invokes this particular method. So if you see here, right, it actually even this EMI method is actually returning the response, and this response will be catched by the LLM. So if you see here this piece of code, right, new AI project client. So the AI project client is to establish a connection with the Azure AI Foundry using this endpoint, and default Azure credentials use the client and client ID, tenant ID, and Azure default configuration for authentication to the AI Foundry. And as AIAgent, right, as AIAgent we have used this model, and then we also use this tools array. So tools AIFunctionFactory.Create calculate EMI. So if you see this calculate EMI, right, this is the method which I have created, and if you see the create parameter, right, this is a delegate method. So we are passing this calculate EMI as a delegate to the create method. And what this Azure AIFunctionFactory.Create does, right, so AIFunctionFactory. Yeah, what does this AIFunctionFactory.Create does, right? It actually converts this calculate AMI method declaration into a JSON format. So when it converts a JSON format, right, it maintain these information about the description of that method, and then when it has to use this particular method, and it also maintains the input parameters that are passing to this method with this description. So let me go to this GitHub Copilot where I had already sent an hi message, and we can actually debug the chart debug view. So which just actually show you how the particular LLM call is made. Okay, so if you see these tools, right, these are the tools which I have added as by MCP servers, and I have these many tools. So if you expand this tool, right, each tool, right, it actually converted into a particular description. So if you see this, right, fetch web page has this description, and it has this input schema. Okay, and it is actually maintaining what are the input properties, so for this, right, is an array, and items are type of string, and what is the description for each parameter. So the Azure AI function factory, right, it actually converts a particular delegate method into a JSON format, so that this can be understood by the LLM. So if you see LLM, right, LLM only understands the tokens. So to understand, like LLM knows that there is a particular function which can be invoked using these parameters, and I can invoke this particular function during the scenario, right, that helps LLM to identify that there is a function. Okay, so let me run this piece of code. Let me save this code and then run this code. So it is taking a little bit of time because of using the default Azure credentials. That is a problem with the default Azure credentials, and it is recommended not to use default Azure credentials in production, and we can use any specific category of credentials like CLA or some other like registered credentials we can use. So if you see this particular, it has actually returned the result correctly here, and it is calculated correctly, and it has written. So if you see this particular response, right, it is actually generated with the help of the tool called the code which we have written. So let me go through another piece of code, right? So I have also have something called function approvals. So this function approvals is some piece of code where I had a send email functionality. So let me go through this code one by one, and then we can also deep dive more here. So yeah, so we need this calculate EMI tool method. We need that. We can remove these two pieces of lines, these two code, yeah, and then let us add this particular new code which we are using for approvals. Yeah, so if you see, I just added a new method called send email. So this email is to send it to a particular user, and we have just added it as a function like reference purpose only. We will not send a real email, but we can add a real email functionality as well when it can be invoked by the LLM. Okay, so if you see here, right, I am just working a similar way with a different set of instructions uh, telling that it is an EMI. User can ask for an EMI, and he can also ask to send an email, and then all that instructions have been provided here. And if you see the same piece of code, right, under tools, so every time you pass a delegate and you want it to be understood by the LLM, you actually need to use this AIFunctionFactory.Create so that it converts into a JSON format. And this is something new, like approval required AI function. So this approval required AI function is something different, right? So it actually needs an approval before it runs to execution. So if you see, if you are using Copilot or anything else, right, if Copilot is trying to access a particular file, or it is trying to access some web search or something, right, it asks. So Copilot asks you for an approval, right? Whenever you do a web search or ask a file. So this is why we have implemented this approval required AI function here, and we need to create an agent session for this to have this maintained, because we are actually maintaining a group of messages here. And we also had this tool approval request content. So tool approval request content is something like LLM decides based on its response.message, right? We have of type tool approval request content. So this helps you identify whether you have any approval request content from the agent, and that can be actually written back to the chat message. If you see this piece of code, right, so if you see here, so I am actually like if whenever the approval request dot count is greater than 0, right, and we are actually converting those approval requests into some function called content. Okay, so if you see this function approval tool call, so it identifies which approval we have to call. Okay, and then if you see this particular piece of right, like I am getting the response from the console, and then I'm identifying whether it is true or not based on this equals y, and then I'm returning a new chat message from the user. So this return chat message to the user, right, it is again returned back to the agent, and based on that, right, agent actually if you see this piece of code, right, once it is done, this part is done, right. So we are actually again sending the user input responses and then the agent session. So based on these user input responses and the session it has maintained previously, agent will again invoke a call to the send email function. So if you see approval request equal to response.messages, right, and then this particular piece of code is again to check for if there are any other approvals, and this is a continuous loop. So but once the agent calls the second method, right, there will be no approval requests within that response messages of the agent, and then it is something like we get the response and we can print the response. So let me run this source code, and then we can actually see how it goes on. So like terminal, so we can run this code. Yeah, if you see here, right, it is asking a reply whether yes or no. Okay, let us see it, let us approve it. Yeah, if you see now, right, the email has been sent to user, and then inputs like if it has identified these are the inputs and this is a summary, and then if you see like the calculation part and everything has been, so it has a, if you see the entire response, it also emailed the result to the user. So this is what we had based on these inputs. Okay, so if you see in this today's video, right, we have covered tool calls as well as what is the use of AI function factory, and then we also understood about approval required AI function. So in the next part we will cover more on agent session and on multi-turn conversations with agent. So yeah, thanks for this